Hello everyone and welcome to Daily Critique number 26, and I'm really sorry if you've been waiting for this one to come out. I've had big problems with the YouTube uploader, so we've lost about a week's worth of these daily critiques, but I'm also running out of people who've actually sent in their images for me to critique as well, so if you do have some images to send in, then please do. Today we're going to be discussing the work of Graham Williamson, who's a Scottish photographer, and he's given us 5 amazing photos of the Scottish Highlands to look through. There's nothing really specific or in common with these 5 images that I want to critique, so as in a few of my previous videos, this is a general critique, so we're going to discuss composition and processing. So let's get started. So these are the 5 images that Graham sent in. We've got a couple from Ben Alligin here that we'll discuss first, which is in the Northwest Highlands in Torridon. This third image I'm not so familiar with. And then finally these 2 of Sulven, which is in the far north of Scotland. Many a hiker's favourite mountain, very unusual as it is. So let's have a look in Photoshop first, and we'll start with this one. So this is from Tom Nagurgach on Ben Alligin, looking across to its twinned summit, Skirmore there. Really beautiful, symmetrical, geometrical mountain, and real favourite view of mine this, and these are the horns of Alligin here and Ben Gerrag in the back. So really nice conditions to be shooting in, great to have this little band of light creeping through and bringing some relief to the mountain, because obviously without that light it really would be too flat, but that little hint is really all you need in this case. And we've got a dramatic sky overhead, lots of interest there. There's a couple of dust spots, and probably more if you look carefully, but otherwise the edit's pretty nice, maybe slightly flat, but I'd rather have it that way than go over the top in the other direction. So maybe you could introduce a little bit more contrast and color in different areas of the image, but otherwise it's a nice edit. My main issue does unfortunately come to the composition of this foreground. It's quite left heavy with these rocks coming through the snow compared to this relatively empty area of snow off on the right hand side of the image. And it's really difficult making good compositions when you have this kind of light snow on your foreground, because it creates this messy texture, and then any subject that properly breaks free of the snow becomes a really strong subject, because there's so much contrast with that surrounding snow. So I mean, if moss were covering the area here, then I think this would work a lot better as a foreground, but as it is, it just makes it feel quite one-sided. And actually this pretty much empty area of snow still has the distractions within it of these little bits of moss poking through. So unfortunately I'm not sure that compositionally this foreground does work for me. One thing it does achieve is adding a lot of depth to the image, and certainly when I've photographed in this area before, I've found it difficult to be happy with this view without a foreground. I do think it does need that extra bit of interest to make something of the scene, and bring in that depth. But other than that, it's a very nice image, and a good one to get started on. So this is taken, I would guess, within feet of the previous image, but looking in a slightly different direction. In fact, this peak here is Ben Gerrag, so that's that face just there. So you can see just how close the 2 are. The dust spots are in the same spot, unsurprisingly. They don't tend to move. Really dramatic image this. It's called Torridon Snowstorm, so I guess that is snow coming down there. It does tend to take on that much whiter colour as it comes down and the wind catches it, so it brings out a lot more texture often than rain, especially the kind of rain that you get in Scotland, which is often a wall. And we've got a really nice rainbow appearing there in the background. I did have a look at the RAW here, and there's been a lot of contrast added to get this kind of rendering. You can see I've got a slightly cooler white balance here, but if I just reset the file, you can see that you really do need to add quite a lot of contrast to bring those colours through. And it's a shame that the rainbow's not a little bit more intense. But still, the conditions are incredibly dramatic, and I think my main criticism would simply be that the interest lies in a relatively local area of the image. Here, the rainbow, the snow falling down over this mountain Liech here, and I'm not sure that compositionally it fits together at all, quite frankly. This entire foreground isn't bringing anything to the image for me other than distraction, because all of the interest is tied in that amazing display of weather in the back. Now, you're racing against time in these conditions, quite obviously, because you know, if it takes you 3 minutes to run over here and get set up again, then this snow's moved right on. So to get shots like this in the right place, you quite often have to anticipate the conditions or wait a lot. And sometimes you just have to react and make the most of what you've got. And it may be that Graham took this photo, then tried running to the edge, and the moment had gone. So I can't be too harsh there, but looking at it from a purely visual standpoint, this foreground really is very distracting. You've got this sort of muddy footpath cutting through the snow here, and rocks jutting out all over the place, and then this really dark crag, which is actually the top of a climbing route, as I understand it. So yeah, unfortunately that foreground doesn't really work, and then we have the mountains coming in on the left, and I'm not sure that they really add anything, particularly given that they're so dark. So I mean, maybe you could put the edge of the frame somewhere there and shoot this width. I did check the EXIF, and it was shot at 24mm, I believe, on a lens that could go as long as 35mm. So without changing lenses, you probably could have achieved a framing like that. And then if you dashed the edge and then perhaps just cropped panorama-ish so that the framing was something like that, but without that foreground, I think this would be an absolutely spectacular shot. But I think for me that simply illustrates the power of removing things from your composition. I really think that it would be a much stronger image without that foreground. Okay, on to the third shot. Ben Rioch, I guess it's said, but my Gaelic pronunciation is not so good. I mean, compositionally, this follows a classic idea, that the leading line, and some of these paths in Scotland are absolutely beautiful, and this is clearly one of them. They're often very well built and maintained, and walkers manage to keep them in good nick too, so they can act as these very strong visual cues to follow through into the view. And we've got this lovely mist sweeping over the front of the mountain there. And I have to say, from an atmosphere point of view, this really does feel like Scotland, with these lovely rich oranges and reds coming through in the grasses, and pretty dramatic clouds drifting through as well. What I would say is that immediately to me, I can tell that there's been quite a lot of colour work going on here, and where you stand on that is up to you. I wish I could achieve these colours more naturally, but you can't really. And so I will just show you the raw file that Graham sent in. So if I just expand this stack here. So he's actually sent me two bracketed shots, and this is my sort of neutral edit. So you can see that you don't have anything like that richness of colour, but it also starts to expose just how strong that colour cast is in the sky. There's a sort of browny red introduced to these clouds there, and I do think that works from an atmosphere standpoint, but personally I find the actual colour a little bit unpleasant, and I think were I to try and achieve this feel myself, I would go in this direction with the foreground and introduce some of these reds and oranges like Graham has, but I'd possibly keep the sky a little cooler, and that would also help to create a sense of depth as well. It would help the sky recede into the background if you kept those cooler colours in there. So yeah, that would be my approach with that one. Now we're on, in fact, let's discuss this one last, and start with this panorama. So Sulven is a really sensational mountain. It's a Inselberg, I believe, which means that the glacier basically flowed around it thousands of years ago and eroded all the rest of the ground, and the mountain was sort of left behind, isolated on its own. And it gives an amazing view of the surrounding mountains. This one here is Canisp, and we have Culmore here, and Culbeg, actually, I think that is just jutting out the back, and Chellock is over there in the background. Yeah, I get really excited about the views in this area. But it's an amazing place to hike, and it's an amazing place to camp, and that's what Graham's done here. In fact, he's camped on the saddle. You can see his tent just down there, which is always nice to include in the image. And obviously, he's set up his camera here to include himself in this self-portrait. Let's look at this from an artistic standpoint rather than a recording the moment and say, how does the composition work? Well, obviously the strongest focal point in the shot is the mountain here, but also Graham himself, because he's partly silhouetted against the area where the sun has just risen. I mean, I guess it's just out of frame over here. So he does stand out very clearly. And we've got these lovely lines of flowing mist below, but I'm not sure that we really need the full width of this. And if we look at this from a balance standpoint, I think a tiny bit more space on the left, or as much as is possible, because you probably wouldn't want to include the sun, would be nice. But I'm not sure that all of this space on the right really adds anything, unless you want to show just how amazing and expansive the view is. But if we look at it purely from a graphic standpoint, then I think a crop like that actually works much better, and maybe I'd lose a bit of the sky as well. So I can understand the desire to go for the wide panorama, but looking at it purely compositionally, I think it balances a much better without all that space on the right. And then from the edit standpoint, I have to say I did look at this and think that the colours looked a little bit muddy, looked a little bit false, just because a little bit too much warmth has been introduced. So if I show you my edit, then you can see what a sort of clear blue looks like by comparison. So again, I've done a very neutral edit, but you can see just how much bluer it would be naturally. And if I look at my white balance settings here, I've actually set it to 6,000 Kelvin, which is actually a very warm white balance. So really, if anything, this is slightly too warm, and we should be going with something colder. But I mean, even if you go to 6,500 Kelvin, you're not quite getting this level of warmth. And I think that's a pity to lose the blues. I mean, I know that people do like these warm colours and the pinks and the oranges, and I understand that maybe increasing the tint, so introducing magenta. If I just mock this up, if I introduce a bit of magenta here, and then introduce a lot of warmth, then you start to think, oh, look at that amazing orange. But you also start to lose colour contrast between the blues and the warmer tones, and you lose the freshness. And so I much prefer those cooler white balances and more neutral tints. You have to be very careful when you're adding magenta to an image. So that's the edit and the composition there. I have to add the caveat that most people would just think that this image was absolutely stunning, wouldn't pick up on what I consider colour issues, because they're relatively subtle and your eyes do work around that problem and eliminate colour casts and imagine the scene as it was, as opposed to the slight cast that's been presented, if that makes sense. So I'm perhaps being unduly harsh there, but nevertheless, that's what I thought. So finally onto this image, looking across, I think from Graham's campsite actually. One really interesting feature of the mountain, if you should ever get to go yourself, is this wall here on the pass. It's really pretty amazing if you walk up there and see a beautifully built stone wall more or less on the top of a mountain. Pretty unusual sight there. So firstly, amazing shot. Great to have the sun breaking behind the peak there in the background. We've got Canisp there on the left. The foreground is maybe adding a little bit of depth. I'm not sure that it's that pretty. I wouldn't include it myself. That's my personal taste. And there are other bits of foreground in the area that might have worked a little better. But sometimes you just have to take the shot, and there may have been some time pressure here. I have had a look through the shots that Graham has sent, and he was clearly struggling with flare and covering the sun and uncovering the sun, and slightly varying his composition. So there was a lot to do to get this shot right. Technically quite challenging, and I think he has broadly succeeded to a great extent, really. My biggest problem really is just with the edit. I mean, I think if you go to the effort of hiking all the way out here and camping on the top and then framing up a nice composition and all the conditions are working for you, it's such a pity when the edit is a little bit disappointing. And that's maybe easy for me to say because I'm very particular about these things, and I've got lots of time to do my editing as well. But I did have a go at editing this, and this is what I came up with. And I have to say that, again, this is a more neutral edit, and yet the colours are so much richer and warmer, and there's a better colour contrast between the blues and the oranges. There's sort of some nice purples coming in, but none of that is artificially introduced. It's all there in the original file. And if I just flick between the two quickly, then you can see that you go between a sort of washed out version to a really quite rich, colourful version. We do have that classic problem that we've seen in a couple of other videos, that our sun is not white. So that's pure white, and that's the sun there. So you can see it's a way off. So you've really got to be careful with that sort of stuff, particularly if you're using the white slider and darkening the white slider in Lightroom. That will do that. It's a fabulously detailed file, really well executed, and it was nice for me to have these files that didn't have flare in various areas, so I could clean it up really nicely. So very well executed, but it is just the edit that's let it down, unfortunately. And I guess as a general idea, what might have happened here is, if we look at the tones in the mountain here, it looks like Graham's tried to recover a lot of detail so that you can see through to the crags and so on. But that creates quite an unnatural contrast between the brightness of the sun and the shadowed area of the mountain here. So that looks a bit weird, and it's also a bit washed out. So you can see that I've kept a lot more shadow in that area and actually let the sun be even brighter, because then you get that real boom feeling of the sun breaking over the mountain there. And you can see our shots are slightly different combinations of images, I think. I'm not sure that I had all of the shots that Graham took of this location. But yeah, spectacular shot, Graham. Just let down by the edit, I'm afraid. But thank you very much for sending those shots in. Always love looking at photos of the Northwest Highlands in particular. So thank you for those. And as I mentioned earlier, if any of you have more photos to send in, then please do, because I will be doing more critiques in the coming days.